There are only a couple of events each year in the off-campus student housing industry that bring all of the industry leaders together. The premier event for the industry is the Interface Student Housing Conference in Austin, Texas. For 2025, this event was held in mid-April and brought over 1,500 attendees and a complete who's who list of executives from student housing firms from around the country under one roof at the JW Marriott in Austin for 3 days of sessions, roundtables, and networking. Student Housing Insight took the opportunity to sit down with several industry executives to discuss their thoughts on the future of the industry and challenges that lay ahead. So buckle up for some amazing insight. This is Student Housing Insight's Future of Student Housing episode. Well, everyone, welcome to, I believe this is the 17th annual Interface Conference. And this is, I think, the 7th or 8th time we've done the, and there goes my phone, reminded me that I need to turn it off. This is the, I guess the 7th or the 8th time that we've done a live podcast. I say live, it's in front of a live audience. It'll come out in a week or two for the podcast, but really excited about this one. We've got, Adam's been on the podcast before, but this is the first time you've done this particular setup, and Sean with Core, this is his first time on the podcast, so excited about that. And of course, Casey and Jen have been here a few times, and but for maybe some folks in the audience that did not know you guys or that's listening to this, let's start with introductions. So Sean, I'll go with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Wes, really appreciate you having us here. I'm Sean Devine, EVP of Property Operations and Experience at Core Spaces. Been there for about 6 months now, and previously through the student housing journey was at Cardinal for a decade, and then even before that, Campus Crest. So been kind of lifelong student housing, but really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
I'm Adam Byrley, Chief Operating Officer at the Price Company. I've been in student housing, all with the Price Company, for this is now 23 years, which is a long time. I feel like it starts to date. It was cool when you had a lot of experience. Now you just feel old. But we have about 40,000 beds or so under management, based in Raleigh, North Carolina, and happy to be here. Thanks for having us, Wes.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. I'm Jen Cassidy. I serve as president for Cardinal Group Companies. We're based in Denver. We are an owner, manager, and developer of student housing and multifamily. I have been in the industry like these guys for a little over 20 years, largely focused on student housing. Cardinal is Denver based, and we have roughly 100,000 beds in our portfolio.
Roughly 100,000 beds. My name is Casey Petersen. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Tailwind Group. I am in my 3rd week at Tailwind Group, but I have...
of which you took a vacation in between.
One of those 3 weeks I was on vacation. Thanks for pointing that out, Wes. I think my boss is actually in the audience. That's not a great look, but thanks.
Well, no, congratulations to Tailwind.
Well, thank you.
We'll just leave it at that.
I'm blushing. And we're Minnesota-based, and we have about 20,000 beds under management.
Now, that's the way to set it up. Leave the place you've been forever, and then...
Yeah, we're growing.
Well, I know we've got some folks from the Peak team that are here as well, and excited to hear from you, Casey. That was... I think it shocked the entire industry that you were making that move, but congratulations on that. So I want to go back to a year ago this time, and going into Interface, and we were here saying, what's happened the past 6-8 weeks? And both Adam and Casey were also on the leadership committee for Shop Talk, which is our monthly webinar that we do for the industry. And I will never forget, I think it was the end of February, and you said, guys, we're just not seeing the movement. And I'm kind of wondering if it's this FAFSA thing, and we're like, FAFSA thing, like what's going on with FAFSA? And it had kind of been in the ether a little bit about, the new system and some of the problems, but it was telling that the universities were far behind in getting out their their offers, financial offers and everything because of the debacle that was happening with the system. And, we had a shop talk on it. Everybody was like, no, it doesn't really seem to be bothering things. Things are moving along. But by the time we got to interface in mid-April, we were saying, hey, something is different. The velocity was great at the beginning. Now all of a sudden we've just stopped. What's going on? I'm kind of curious because obviously everything started picking up in June. I think we, as an industry across the country, only fell behind maybe 0.5% year over year. I've had several discussions with you guys over the past several months, and things we're doing pretty well as far as occupancy was concerned. But now that you've had some time to reflect, I really wanted just to kind of get everyone's opinion on what do you think that was? Was it FAFSA? Was it was it pushback on rent growth? Was it and I know a lot of it's going to be market dependent, but just want to kind of hear from you guys what it was, and has it impacted both what students are deciding this leasing season, as well as maybe something on your with your marketing plans that you guys changed up.
Well, I'll get us kicked off and just say that it's all of the things you said, and I'll give the blanket answer on everything, which is everything is a market by market dynamic. But did FAFSA play a role in velocity? Yeah, I'm sure it did. Did new supply play a role in velocity? Yeah, it did. It's kind of like 1,000 different cuts. So I think we all, as an industry, are always trying to point to one thing, one dynamic that's happening as the reason why X, Y, Z is happening. And the reality is that it was a confluence of a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean, interface last year, it was a likely and it was available excuse a little bit at the time, because it was like, oh, we don't really know what's going on, because it was the first time that velocity had really, come to a halt. Like, and it was fairly dramatic last spring, because we were on fire, and then it literally just somebody cut the spring off. So I think it was certainly played a factor, but I just don't think it. And ultimately, when it came down to August, I don't think it was a big driver of why velocity was down. I really don't. I think it's all pricing, and I think it's all supply and demand in each market.
I'd like to take a differing
Please.
opinion from Adam when we do
I know.
these things. I actually feel really differently about it. So I feel like we saw a slowdown at the end of the season before. I really felt
Sure,
very
you're right.
confident going into September that last year was going to be a different year. FAFSA wasn't even a talking point
Right.
at that point. And I think we saw certain markets come out the gates really strong because students understood the supply and demand fundamentals in that market. And if they wanted to be somewhere, they were going to commit early because they wanted to be in that building. If you look back at the numbers, this week last year was the highest delta on FAFSA applications year over year, and the whole point of the cycle. So there was.
See, I love you. Always bring data, Jen.
Well,
Always.
There was a distinct difference in certain states, like Arizona specifically. If you were in Flagstaff or Tempe, Arizona was really affected by FAFSA. And as you started to see that delta minimize, you did start to see better pre-leasing in those areas. But I think, on top of that, you can look at the total enrollment headline and say not a lot changed. But if you really dig in, a lot changed. Like if you look at first-year enrollment, if you look at online enrollment, the number of students physically present in a market that are our demographic did change. And so I think, it reemphasizes the importance, if you're on the acquisition side, of market selection and understanding the actual demand curve for a market and who is physically there. And from a supply standpoint, while overall supply is down and has continued to be down, there are certain markets that are getting a ton of supply. I mean, if you look at Knoxville, if you look at Gainesville, there's a lot of supply coming in. And so understanding not just what's happening at the macro level, but where does your deal fit? Who are you actually appealing to in that market? And not just the main institution there, but, the community college or the trade schools or whatever. Some of us don't have all, pedestrian Class A deals. So we have to think about, the totality of the market and who we appeal to. But I think To me, the writing was on the wall. I always kind of felt like we're in a bit of a bubble of a false positive for 2 years. Like demand was almost accelerated, and I expected it to level out. And I think FAFSA was just a fun surprise to try to figure out in the midst of what I would have called a normalizing year anyways.
So, I mean, that's sort of my point, is that it was just a thing that happened to reduce our velocity in a given year when it was probably already going to happen. And people pointed to that, and I agree with you, Jen. I do think it did play a little bit of an impact, but those students, once they got processed, they signed leases, and we ended up at an occupancy that was, that was stable at the end of the year. And so for me, I think it's more of it just kind of upset students at the whole process. It almost turned them off to college, right? Like, this is what I have to do to apply to school. I don't even know how much money I'm going to get. 'Cause that's the whole thing. That a lot of times, especially this year, they're getting approved, but they don't know the funds yet that they're getting. And so I think that's delaying some.
But it also affected the kids that were already there.
For sure. It's not just freshmen,
Or they
right?
can come back.
Exactly.
That's the barrier of entry, right? This is just a sales process, right? It's always if you have a lead or a closing issue. And all we did was add another variable onto that. But I think that, FAFSA was a highlighted one. Anytime there's a government conversation, it's always easy to point to that. But I do think like the rate growth as well, I think participated in as much, right? That opened up other markets. I know we've seen that in certain markets that the shadow market has grown.
Yep.
And it means when you have that type of rate growth, people are going to take more time to make decisions, right? And we all sit here and we say urgency, closing urgency, and that's a real concept that I think we have to look at is how it all impacts it and avoid, the single talking point.
Right. Yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head on something I was going to mention as well. And we were just talking about it this morning is that conventional multifamily in a lot of these markets, particularly more urban settings, if they got a lot of new supply on the multi side, that softened the student market. That these multi operators need to fill their beds as well, and so I think we saw in some of these markets students leaking out of purpose-built student housing and into multi. And we at least believe that as the multi business continues to stabilize out because it's absorbing new supply just like any market. That multi doesn't really want students in their properties anyways, and so that'll lead to people kind of flocking back to purpose-built student.
Well, I just think that's why like the decision timeline, right? I think, Jen, you've actually talked about like how the clicks and impressions are still at the level, if not higher, but it's actually the basis is how many decisions do you have? How do you put this together, right? When you had a purpose-built student housing market by the bed leasing, like it was, one of 5 choices. Now all of a sudden you said, well, can we sign by the unit at this conventional deal at a different price? I think that makes a big difference in velocity.
Well, I think you saw last year, people in September lining up on the streets to get the shiny new product. And then this year they realized that they didn't have to do that necessarily. The ones that really wanted a specific building and wanted to see Peyton Manning went and did, they went and signed up for those buildings. But I think in a lot of these markets, they generally realized, hey, maybe we have the upper hand a little bit in some markets, not in all, but in some, especially Tallahassee or a Knoxville specifically.
So just for those keeping it score, that's the second.
That's the second dig. Yeah. That's right. He's the new guy.
The biggest problem I had was I joined 2 weeks after that excitement.
You can't claim me.
I wasn't there.
I think you touched on something, which is like FAFSA aside, because FAFSA applications maybe aren't totally at the level of 2 years ago, but they are back up. And this year is slower. It is slower out the gates. It's been slower. And to Sean's point, like we were talking about this on our prep call, the amount of impressions and visits to our websites in some cases are up, but students are just taking longer to decide. And why is that? I think everybody in this room probably wants the answer to that question, and none of us have the direct answer to it. And I do think some of it is what they see, but I think also acceptance and what the universities are doing, playing a big role. I mean, you look at some of these markets, you've got 8 bedrooms, you've got 6 bedrooms. They all want to live together. They're waiting to decide on that one person that maybe doesn't know yet. And so it's really kind of, I think, getting our site teams really dialed into what is happening at your university. What is the key dates that are going on there? What are your prospects saying? What are they waiting for? And, some of them, I think it's less about shopping around. I mean, there's so many great places that have a lot of the same physical attributes, but the brand, the experience of where they want to be is what they're gravitating to. And I think they're waiting to kind of go in groups and make those decisions.
Well, like you have a really good school like UT here in Austin. You have until May to decide whether you're going to accept to enroll at UT. You got accepted. You have until May to realize whether or not you're going to go there or not. So these schools have continued, and maybe that is a trend from FAFSA from last year. They've pushed back their acceptance deadlines, and once they push them back, it's like they can't move them forward again. So they're stuck to having this cycle of, oh, well, you can now wait until May to make your decision on whether or not you're going to come to UT. That was crazy. I mean, it used to be like, February, March? And now it's May. It used to be the secondary and tertiary schools would be in the summertime. Well, now it's these primary, really tier one institutions that have pushed their acceptance dates back until May.
And this is the acceptance date, but then you've also got, when they assign out on-campus housing.
Yeah, and a lot of those
they're pushing
schools,
that
if
too.
you're getting accepted in May and you haven't already, generally it's like you can come to UT, but you're not getting housing, at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to get into a specific market, but I'm going to stay away from that.
We don't do that. Can ask Jen, just like with your 100,000 beds. 100,000 beds.
Roughly.
Roughly.
Humble brag.
Roughly 100,000 beds. You have all sorts of different price points, right? You have the uber high end, and you have the uber not high end. Do you see that velocity shift different in different price points? So in other words, we've got a lot of economic uncertainty across the country right now. Like, are we seeing a slowdown at the top end of the market because people are saying, well, hold on, junior's going off to college, and I know I'm going to put him somewhere, but I don't know, whether my job's safe, and so I'm going to wait on signing, for one of Sean's properties, or would I do something a little bit more economical?
I mean, historically, I would say yes, and this year I would say no. I think it's sort of consistent across the board. I think last year we definitely saw direct correlation with FAFSA in some of the tier 2 markets and the lower price point communities because our prospects were relying on those funds to pay for rent, and that was very tangible. This year, I think we're seeing even at the highest price points, there is difficulty or a slowdown, so to speak, across the board. So it is kind of an interesting thing to point out in that I think it's across the board.
I have a data point. Actually, I looked it up. So on Monday, the average rent, I separated it into 4 tiers. So average rent for a property that was over $1,200 last year at this time was our number 1 pre-lease percentage. And now it's number 3. And the $1,000 to $1,200 price point is our number 1 pre-lease. Now they're all within like 4 or 5 points of each other. It's not like dramatic, but it's like maybe moms and dads have said, enough. Or, hey, we're not having as much funds to send you to school this year, not from a economic perspective, but just financial aid or whatever. And maybe we're going to, you're not going to the $1,500 bed property. You're going to the $1,000 bed property. And, I think that's telling for us. And, and I like your new classification. I'm going to have uber high end and uber not so high end.
There's only two classes.
It's a great way to describe it.
I think you're seeing that, though, at the individual property level, because if you see like the demand curve for 5s and 6s this year have higher velocity because they're affordable price points versus 1s and 2s always filled first.
Sure, but my 5s and 6s are more expensive than my 4s because they're so unique and there's not as many of
There's
them.
also not as many.
Right.
That's the misleading stat there.
So before we move away from the leasing topic, one thing that I think we talked a little bit on the prelim call, and it's come up on Shop Talk multiple times this past 4 or 5 months, but kind of the leak that we seem to be experiencing with students going into the conventional market. Is that something that you guys are really able to measure at this point, or?
Nope, no, we can't measure anything. I mean, really. I mean, you really can't when it comes to that kind of stuff. I mean, there's just the data is not there, and it's a real troublesome aspect for this industry. And I'll go on my tangent upon that later in private, but
not in public.
Not public
information.
The data is just not there from our conventional competitors to tell us how many students they have, right? Like it's just, you can see occupancy levels, and you can see occupancy levels rise and decline in maybe submarkets that traditionally would take, students, like at NC State, for example. There's Cameron Village, a submarket, easily can take students because it's walking distance to campus, or
Are you seeing them purposely show up on campus to market? Or are they going to the off-campus housing fairs?
No.
I think you can probably tangentially see it. Where you go on their websites and they're talking about how far away they are,
Yes.
from campus. Like there's no way to perfectly measure it, but you can tell whether or not they're actually targeting and welcoming that demographic.
Right.
Well, and the feedback from the leasing agents, I think, is where we first start to hear it, right? It's like, where do we lose that lead to? And you start to actually talk to them, and you feel that from the sales team. And they straight out say that, right? Certain markets, I think you have to have a metropolitan kind of feel, like Raleigh,
Yeah.
like a LA. I know we've seen that a ton, where I think, again, the rate growth was, awesome, and I think it will still continue to be strong, but you're seeing the ability for folks to pivot back to, buy the bed isn't as, unique as it needs to be to make that price difference.
Yeah.
And let's face it, students, like Jen's point about the affordability piece, you can't get the buy the bed 3, 4, 5 bedroom in conventional multifamily, right?
Yeah.
It's only the ones and the twos where you're really competing.
Yeah.
And in some markets, in the softness in multifamily, the ones and twos really, that's all they have, and so they took a nosedive. And the ones and twos on conventional now can be more expensive, cheaper than our ones and twos as a student. And for them, there's no difference other than just the resident life programming piece of it.
Well, and conventional shadow market is so different depending on what market you're in.
100%.
Like some of it is mid-rise conventional
Yep.
apartments. Some of it is a whole shadow market of older homes that an
Yeah.
aggregator is just leasing out of one office. So
Yeah.
it's like, what do the students in that market value? I was in Gainesville yesterday, and there's a huge pedestrian shadow market, and it's all older homes, and it's all full. And it always has been, and now there's a bunch of, Class A pedestrian product too. So it's like, it really is hard to quantify because the definition of conventional supply in each of these markets is so different.
Well, and we know what the definition of conventional new supply is. I guarantee you, if you're going into anybody's chats, with college students, they're not saying, "Hey, well, do they lease by the bed?" They don't give a crap about whether or not they lease by the bed. It's like, does it have a pool? Is it close to campus? Can I live with my friends, et cetera? So, that's why it's so important for us as operators to be able to understand, like, how do we stack up, not just with purpose-built student, but with the multi-market that's close by as well, because they're competitors, whether or not we can measure them or not, they're competitors.
Well, you have to think a student is not necessarily, maybe they do. They don't type in student apartments near UF.
Right.
They
Right.
just type in apartments near
100%.
UF, right? And so,
You mentioned something about the ones and the twos. I've been having a argument with a couple of architects lately. I'm of the opinion that your ones and twos, especially your ones in studios, do not need to be commingled on the floors with 4 and 5 bedroom units, which are primarily going to go to undergrad students.
you just build a whole floor of ones.
Put them all on the first floor.
I can see why you're getting an argument.
They don't need.
That's what I said.
They don't, yeah, but I mean, I do these focus group studies, and the grad students are like, if I've got to get on an elevator with a sophomore, I'd rather go to another market. I mean, not to another market, to a non.
That is a problem
student.
that I have not really thought about.
Yeah, well,
Wes
About
is
who
adding
was on the
another-
elevator with who. But I like it. It's a good thought.
so I do focus group studies. If
Okay.
you ever
Yeah.
need somebody, okay.
like that.
Anyway,
He's selling.
by the way, I want to congratulate Jen. It is now officially 23 minutes on the dot, and you have not said one word about the national championship in Gainesville. I thought you were going there a while ago,
Stay
but
away from it. Go Gators.
all right, I want to switch and talk about centralization. We got thrown into centralization 5 years ago with the onset of COVID. I'm sick and tired of moderating panels on centralization. Sorry if I've had to moderate a panel with you on centralization.
But you're going to ask
But
the
here you
question.
are.
But I want to ask, because some of you guys have been really into that. No one has been able to ignore it. But I'd really like to ask you guys, what are some lessons learned? What are some things that that you've realized through that process?
I think, yeah, we'll jump into it. I think my biggest takeaway from it all is the thesis was always right? The technology was going to be there. The ability to make efficiencies are there. I think my biggest takeaway has always been that you have to still focus on the performance of the asset, right? Whether or not that is removing the tasks from the teams on site where they're losing that head count. I actually even was talking to Adam outside about this, is the ability to still hire that account manager that is doing the centralization. If we're talking ARAP, it's still about, is that person good, right? Like, and that's, to me, is still performance of the asset. Are they doing that process? And that is, I think, one of the things that was maybe, third on that list of like, hey, this can reduce down OpEx. This is the way to get better efficiency with AI, but also like the performance of the asset.
I mean, for me, the Price Company we've taken a very slow and steady pace as it comes to this. And, I applaud Jen and Cardinal and others that have really, dove headfirst into the centralization. And for me, frankly, it's awe-inspiring to see a whole new model just kind of pop up out of nowhere. And whether that model is right for everybody, I think, is still to be seen. I think we all can accomplish what we want to do with certain aspects of centralization. To your point, I think the concept is really smart and is really thoughtful, but how each group and each firm gets there is going to be very different. And I think ultimately we all need to drive performance, as you mentioned, and it's just who is responsible for driving performance. Is it the on-site property manager? Is it the regional? Is it the centralization team? Is it a combination of all? Probably, but somebody ultimately is responsible for
Who's
it.
in charge?
And who's in charge? And that's where my, I guess, sort of patience has really, stemmed from, is like, we want to make sure that our properties are performing. We want to make sure the NOI is as high as it can possibly be. How do we get there? Still TBD.
Sure. I'll give my answer, and then Jen has done all this work, and so she can give us like the real answer. But I think, Sean, to your point, like, it is still a people business, right? This is still a people business. The quality of people that you have either on site or as part of your centralized team is what the difference maker is between whether or not your efforts are successful or not successful. I think the important part is realizing what your priority is. Like, why are we exploring centralization? Not just because it's the buzzword at every panel that we go to that Wes apparently moderates, but because we want to have consistency of execution. When I was doing the centralization efforts at Peak, it was about how can we mute the impacts of turnover, right? Turnover is a real thing in our business, particularly with leasing folks. So how can we mute that impact by centralizing, creating a more consistent customer experience? But ultimately, again, it's a people business. And what I think is that it actually creates more opportunity for our teams, right? So if somebody can see their career pathing can be starting out on site, and then they can move into a centralized role, which allows them to see more of a portfolio, then they can move into a regional role, so on and so forth. There's a lot better career pathing, or a lot different career pathing than we've had in the past. So I think centralization is here to stay.
Sure.
I think it is a thing that's going to continue to happen in student housing and in multifamily, for that matter. But what I think is really important is, again, remembering what you got into it for, and also backing away. And Jen and I talked about this before. Backing away after you've done it for 6 months and say, are we realizing what we thought we were going to do? Like, where do we need to tweak this process, to make it actually, provide the results that we're looking for in the first place? So backing away and measuring it on a real-time basis is also super critical.
Yeah, I appreciate the nature of the question about what have you learned. First of all, I can't take credit for all of Cardinal's centralization efforts. We have an amazing team on the centralization front, but also this has been done on the backs of our operations team members, who I give a ton of credit for managing through major change. I think for us, we always looked at it as specialization and really identifying what can only be done on site and leaving those things on site for the people that are best at doing them. and then supporting them and spending their time in the right place by taking those things offsite. And I think you hit on a really important point, which is turnover. Like, everyone in this room has been associated with a community where you had a really great manager and you had a really great year, and then that manager left, and then something changed and you just couldn't put your finger on it. And it's like, we can't build our business on the backs of a person. We have to put a process and a system in place that A player can thrive in. And I think that we used to say it's the technology is the future. Technology is now. Like, it's here. And if we're not adopting it and we're not using it to be efficient, I don't think our properties can grow NOI and perform at the level that they're capable of, or that we expect when we underwrite them and acquire them. Because if you look at what is controllable, there are very few categories that we can control. You can't control utilities. You can't control taxes and insurance at this point, but you can control payroll. And you have to control payroll. And if you look at the wage data in the last 5 years for leasing and maintenance, is far, far beyond what inflationary wages were. So by incorporating technology in a centralized model, you're able to preserve or grow NOI, but deliver a better experience, in my opinion. It's like we were talking earlier about students waiting longer. Can you imagine in this day and age a student going to a website and not getting the information they need when they want it? They're going to another one. They're not waiting. And so by having technology that is, machine learning that can answer their questions in that moment in time when they want the answer, that's how you're retaining them. That's how you're getting them to lease with you. And you simply can't have that type of accessibility 24/7 with just people. And so obviously I'm a big believer of it. I think what we've learned is you really have to be dialed in on change management. You have to empower the teams with, this is what you are responsible for, and not what you're responsible for, but what you're great at and where we want you to spend your time. And here's how we give you the trust that those things we're asking you to let go are actually going to be done. Not just trust, but visibility, and having those agreed to KPIs so that everyone feels responsible for the outcome.
So I want to ask a question about cost. And is the cost what you guys thought it was going to be? Has it been more? Has it really?
Is it an expense reducer, basically?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I understand what you're saying on the payroll side, but I'm just wondering if because all this stuff ends up getting charged back to the properties for the most part. And, are there asset managers that are saying, whoa, I thought we were supposed to be saving money with this?
I think there's a little bit of both. Obviously, there's a cost to technology. There's a cost to having centralized specialists. You look at a community that's 1,000 beds and a community that's 400 beds, the spread on a position is not as significant as the spread in bed count, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
I think it depends. I think one of the things that we're seeing is, what is that specific community need? What level of centralization? You have some small scattered site communities that might operate with 2 people already, right? They're already a thin staff, but what is the value proposition? What other ILSs or softwares does it take away? How does it improve reputation? How does it reduce your marketing spend? So there's a lot of different, I think, correlated points, but I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all.
And I think your question about why is it important to you, or Casey, you mentioned it, why is it important to you to centralize to your specific group, right? And yours was, turnover, like you were having trouble finding spots. And for us, whatever it is, I don't know, culture, that a great COO or something, I don't know. But we just don't, in occasional markets or occasional properties, we have some turnover, but we just don't have the issue of turnover. And we actually have the opposite, where we will sell an asset, or we have people that they want to stay, and they want to stay for, we have a manager that is literally, we're selling the deal. This is the last deal we have in the market. And she says, I will scrub toilets to stay with price. And so it's like, you really want to make that person, stay with you. And so we just don't have the turnover. And I think maybe that's why it's been a little bit slow for us, is that we didn't have that pain point. And I think it's really important what Casey and Jen said is, make the centralization process what works for your organization, right? It works for Tailwind. I was going to say Peak. It worked for Peak when Casey was there. It works for Cardinal. But don't feel the pressure necessarily. Go in it with the right mindset of, why are you solving for this problem?
That was a case study in how to use a podcast as an ad for a price company.
Yes, I'm good. I'm good at
That's
that. Yeah.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
I'm just looking forward to the
snip
next
that.
price retreat when they have shirts that say, "I will clean
Yeah,
toilets."
yeah. That'll be an edit. We'll edit that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Now,
thank you.
this next segment is brought to you by Price Company. No, but I was going to just
Hey,
say.
Casey, pull the mic.
Pull closer.
Well, more towards your mouth. There you go.
Sorry. What I was going to say, is I agree with you, and whether it's a great COO or whether it's a great culture or whatever, I agree with both of those things. By the way, but I do think that the nature of our business, we are in student housing, we have a lot of student workers. Whether or not those student workers will likely be with us for a very limited amount of time, right? Like part of our jobs is to make that experience awesome while they work for us, but they're going to turn over at some stage in the game because they're going to become doctors and lawyers, and some of them will suck into the vortex of student housing and never let them out. But regardless, that level, that consistency of execution is going to happen not necessarily just because of turnover, because of the nature of our business.
I agree.
And so that's really what I was getting at is you have to have with technology you can automate the consistency of experience, whether it be a prospect experience, a resident experience. It doesn't take away the need for the human intervention when it's appropriate, but when there are things that we can automate and mute the impacts of whether it be turnover or just inconsistent execution, then we think that is a altogether good outcome.
I would also say we could retain the manager that wants to clean toilets in a centralized role.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that has been a
They
big
can work
advantage.
from home and
No
just
one has
hang
come up
out,
with
right?
centralized
Yeah.
toilet cleaning yet.
All right, let's get to some current affairs. I know it's early, but everybody's talking about it, so why don't we talk about it for a little bit? Tariffs, in turn. What are you guys hearing? Is it anything you're sweating about?
Yes.
Adam and I talked, and it feels a lot like COVID, right? It feels like the uncertainty. You don't know day in and day out. But I think groups that are able to focus on the purchasing, the agreement, the understanding, having people out in the marketplace listening. I sit back and I think of our friends in the furniture side, right? I think this week is going to be a very difficult week for them fielding questions because I think just the uncertainty, right? I think that to me is, the biggest challenge we have going forward right now.
It's going to impact this.
Yes.
A full circle. I mean, every aspect of our business will be impacted. How much that impact will be, it's still TBD, but it absolutely will be impacted. And for anybody that says they know how much it will impact us today is lying because I don't think we have any idea because like you said, every day is a different data point. It'll affect our business, not just from turn, but oddly enough, like, the past couple of days, usually when the stock market goes down, people dump their money into treasuries, which, makes the 10-year and 30-year go down. What's the exact opposite of what's happened over the last 3 days? And treasuries have spiked because people are actually selling treasuries as well. And that's going to impact how we buy deals and how we, get interest rates and things like that. So it's not just on the supply side. It's going to be on every aspect of our business. And it could be a 6-month impact. It could be entire administration impact. We'll see.
Yeah, I'll go for the former. I'm hoping it's just
Well,
short
we all
term.
hope.
But yeah.
We all hope. We all
I think
thought,
if this goes on for 4 years.
we all thought it
we've
was
got-
2 weeks to stop the spread too. And here, we still see people wearing masks, and it's
And I think you're spot on. Like anybody who claims that they know what it's going to ultimately be is probably being maybe not lying, but being institutionally dishonest with themselves about about their ability to see the future. I remember when COVID started, using your example, somebody asked me, an investor asked me, what do you think is going to happen with delinquency? And I was like, I think it's going to be like 30%. I don't think kids are going to pay their rent. And guess what? They all paid their rent. And so I
Even
was
more so, almost,
I was,
right?
I was dead wrong. And so I don't want to even pontificate about what's going to happen
Yeah.
with tariffs because there's a lot of time between now and when we take delivery of furniture, using Adam's example, as to what the tariffs will be at that time.
Well, the biggest impact specifically with furniture is going to be on the new devs. Unless if you've got a major change out that's planned for existing property, but
Maybe it's a bigger line item, but from a percentage impact, it's going to be pretty consistent across the board.
Yeah.
We did get a couple phone calls earlier this week. We're already starting to get advisement from furniture suppliers of like, hey, it's going to be double digits. We don't know exactly what it's going to be. I agree. I empathize with them this week. They're probably having tough conversations, but I think to Adam's point, it's going to be somewhat of everything that's affected in some way.
yeah.
Because even if they make the product in the United States, a lot of the product is still being made, like brought in, imported to then be assembled in the United States, right? So just because it's assembled here doesn't necessarily mean that it's all made domestically. So I think you're going to have, significant impacts.
Yeah.
And whether these companies decide to pass the full tariff through, that's ultimately what's going to happen. Are they going to say we're passing the full tariff on, or are we just going to reduce our margins significantly to keep business? Because there will be some that say we're going to only pass through 5% because we want to go grow our business, and that's a way for them to reduce their margins and grow their business. So we'll see.
Well, a little bit of a preview of another episode that's coming up on the podcast. The great thing about being in Austin is there's so many student housing people we could talk to. And I got to sit down for an entire 2 hours with Bill Bayless yesterday, just kind of recapping his career and what he's doing now with Maslow Campus Communities. And it's we talked a lot about a lot of the hard things that this industry's been through, and of course, he's seen it all, and tariffs have not spooking him at all. That's for sure. But the thing about this industry is just time and time again we're proven that we'll weather this.
We're pretty resilient.
Yeah.
Well, what we learned through COVID was certainly that, college kids want to go to college and they want to hang out with their friends.
That hasn't changed.
That hasn't changed. And it's, to your point, Casey, about, paying rent, right? April 1st, 2020, we were like, oh, they still want to be here. Like, our biggest issue is keeping them apart from each other.
So I want to talk about the future a little bit, and not far out future, but kind of what the next 5 years looks like. We've seen a huge impact with AI. It's going to continue to impact things, but you now have a humanoid robot in your office, Adam.
It's not in my office, but it does live next door to us at our subsidiary at Iris Technologies. But we can. You talk about a commercial.
Yeah, this
right
next
there.
segment is
Right?
brought to you by Iris Technologies.
Next to you, brought to you by Iris. Look, I think ultimately, it's all just speculative as to what it can do and what we can do as an industry. But what it does say is there is a lot of stuff out there that we weren't thinking about 6 months ago, and that 6 months from now we won't be, we won't have thought about it today. And so it's pretty cool, actually. If you want to see it, it'll be at our event later.
Will it be bringing us drinks or?
I don't know what it'll do, but it waves and dances and walks, and it weighs 104 pounds, which is 4 pounds too heavy to fly on an airplane. So it took a little bit of time to get here. So.
Did you have to take an arm off and carry it with you? Or?
just a battery issue or something. I don't know. I just get updates here and there.
So if future of student housing. I mean, maybe we don't all have robots, the next 5 years in our office or at our properties, but and I'm not talking about just from a technology standpoint. I mean, what do you guys really see impacting our industry that you've got your eye on?
I think international student demand will be a big headline story. We've seen, kind of a little bit of a dynamic shift in terms of how many international students we're seeing and where they're coming from. And I think that, continued, policies of the current administration coupled with policies of, I was in Canada 6 months ago, and, their policy then, I think it's since shifted, was if you come to school there, you can stay there. You'll get full citizenship once you go to school there. And so I think that was drawing a lot more Chinese students were going to Canada to go to school than were in the U.S. And so I think that, those,
and that's been the one optimistic thing that the current administration has said they want to do. Now, will it happen? And
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. So, but I think that what we're already seeing is like a shift in country of origin. Where
Yeah.
the U.S. is losing market share of certain of Chinese students to, I think, Australia and Canada and the U.K. And we're seeing more Indian students coming over. And so, how does that change, demand? How does that change, what pricing that they can afford when they come over? I don't know, but I think that international student demand and how it looks 5 years from now is likely a lot different than it looks today.
I agree with that. I think legal policy is going to continue to shape our industry. It already is. Everything from data sharing to junk fees to fee transparency. I mean, I talked about it earlier in terms of market selection. If anybody's operating in the state of Colorado, you know that it's changing every single day. And just having your finger on the pulse of each state you operate in and each jurisdiction that you operate in is so much more at the top of our list than it's ever been, and making sure that we comply with that. So, all of us operate pretty big footprint, and keeping on top of that and being able to not just change our practices to comply, but just teach our teams, get them to understand the why behind it and how to successfully administer those changes, and work with the residents, I think is going to continue to be a big topic.
I think it's a lot about user experience for us at Core. I mean, I think when we start to talk about this, we're a little bit less impacted from the international market specifically, and certain markets not. But for us, we have a really big focus on our user experience. What is that customer service that we're getting, right? Because I think that we talk about delays and decisions. We have first-time renters, right, that need to be coached through that process. And so having a team on site that's really focused on delivering that top end, to Jen's point, there's a lot of rooftop pools, there's a lot of movie rooms, there's a lot of great gyms out there. How do you differentiate yourself? How do you make yourself not a commodity? How do you actually give that first-in-class experience, from a customer service standpoint? So I think that's, to me, is actually something that's going to be coming back with all the technology, with all the wonderful AI bots that are talking to you, still being able to answer that one question and be there for that person that needs that question.
And I'll give a shout out to a lot of the folks. I know Jen and Casey are passionate about the mental health wellness coalition that we have in the space. I think that there's going to be a real shift from social programming to sort of the wellness programming across our brands, right? Mm-hmm. I think that not only investing in the students' success academically, but also in their well-being. And so I think that'll be a big driver for our brands to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years or however long, just to be able to reach out to those students that are going to need, they already do, but even every year that goes by, they need it even more. And
it's funny you say that. Like, I think this reminds me a little bit of Gen Z, as a major population. They want that, right? They want that. Gen Alpha that's coming in expects it,
yep.
right? They've grown up in that space, and I think it kind of reminds me a little bit of recycling with the millennials, right? It's well, yeah, we'll recycle. Gen Z was no, we recycle, and I think that's the same type of,
But I think it's even like how we design properties, and it used to kind of be sensory overload and neon signs and all of this stuff, and I think it's a shift to calm and well-being, and having red light therapy as a I don't even know what that is, but I saw it and it was pretty cool. But those things are what they're looking for. I got a feeling
he puts a mask on every night.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I don't, but it would be cool if I did. No, but I think those are the types of amenities that you're going to start seeing: less social, more wellness, more holistic, well-being type
peace
things.
Of mind.
Yeah, peace of mind kind of stuff. So, just a thought.
Well, guys, we're at a point where I want to give the audience, if they have questions, a chance to ask. We've got a microphone. It does not feed into the speakers. It's for the recording of the podcast. So if you guys have any questions, raise your hand. Josh will get you the microphone.
What are the passions, whether it's being on a board or your Peloton in the morning, that have kept you in the industry for 2 decades or less or more, as the case may be?
I can start.
Go ahead.
So I was on site yesterday in Gainesville. Obviously, the energy in that city was pretty electric yesterday. And one of the CIs at our community, when I got there, I said, "Well, how was it last night?" And he was like, "It was the best day of my life." He was like, "Core memory unlocked," and it's just seeing young people at such a pivotal point in their life. Learning from us, getting their first work experience, living with us, sort of foundational to who they will become, how successful they will be on their college journey, and hopefully the future leaders of this country. Always has inspired me, but I have a 15 and 12-year-old boys, so that's becoming a lot more relevant to me now because my son's 3 years away from living in one of our communities, so that's definitely the thing that keeps me coming back for sure.
And I'll just piggyback on that. I used to say it keeps me young, and then I have all this gray hair, and I've forgotten about saying that. But I do think that we always talk about how we have this the youth is working for us and how we get to create this experience. And I stole this I think from Chick-fil-A, but Chick-fil-A had this kind of adage with their teams, which was we know that most of you are not going to graduate or are not going to become managers of Chick-fil-A, right? You're likely going to just be the cashier or the burger flipper or the chicken flipper, I guess. Whatever the case may be, you may have a limited time here with us, but that time is going to be world class, and you're going to pick up skills that will effectively make you a better electrical engineer or lawyer or doctor or whatever it is later on in the future. And so our ability to have that impact gets me out of bed in the morning, and I think it's true for all of us.
Yeah, I think that not only the impact to our team, but just watching the impact that they can make to the residents, right? We're, collectively we are charged with a ton of experiences for those folks coming in. And, we all have bad incident reports, we all have rough days, but when you see that community manager making an impact to someone, I think it's why you come, right? That's why you show up every day.
It's for me, it's the people that I do it with, at Price. I've been lucky enough to have a core team with me for 15 of those 20 years. And you get up out of bed every morning and you show up because they're going to show up. And it's sort of like soldiers in battle, and you go through, even if they're almost the terrible things are what sort of cements your partnership together. And so for us, it's like, I work hard and I do these things because they work hard. Mm-hmm. And the jobs, the regional manager, the site manager, those jobs are hard now. I mean, when I was a site manager, I didn't have to worry about renter's insurance and service and all these other types of, all the different things that they're managing. And now the site manager and the regional manager, it's a thankless position almost. And so to your point, getting out and really realizing, hey, how much they're impacting our residents, but then also seeing how hard they work is what inspires me to work as hard as I do.
And let's take it a step further too. It's really the industry. I mean, it's great at Price, it's great at Tailwind, it's great at Cardinal, it's great at Core, all those places. But I recently made a big career change, and some of the first phone calls I made, I called Jen, was one of my first phone calls I made. She's a competitor, but she's also a friend. So the relationships that we have in this business, I really like to think, and I've never worked in any other industry, but I like to think that they're unique to this business.
I agree.
Any other questions? That was a great question, Jonathan, by the way. I think you've been there so long because you've got a chief fun officer. Not everybody else has a chief fun officer.
That's true.
Kurt, good to see you.
What tech are you most excited about in your firms right now? And then how are you balancing the operational strategy with the technology adoption with your teams?
I couldn't put my finger on one. I think what I'm excited about is really bringing the full user experience together. So one of the things we're really focused on is not implementing just one technology, but kind of giving the prospect the choice. Like, do you want the self-guided tour? Do you want the in-person tour? Do you want the virtual tour on the website? It's kind of like people want choice. Like, I was at a community and I was taking a self-guided tour, and I got in the elevator with 3 girls and I said, what do you think about the self-guided tour? And one's like, I never want to talk to another person again. I love it. And the other one was like, I hate it. I want to take a tour with somebody that I can ask questions to and understand their experience. And I was like, This is the exact case study of the fact that our residents all have different preferences. Some people still go to a mall, some people shop at Amazon. And so I like the way the technology is coming together to provide options. I think your question on like how do you tie that into operational strategy, it just goes back to getting the teams really to understand the why. I think sometimes we have information bias and we're at the front end of rolling out a strategy and we have to stop and take the time to give them examples to see how it affects the end user, the resident, in a positive way. And just really set the guardrails for them on how do you interact with this technology, where does the technology stop and where do you pick up? Because I do think the human interaction is still required. But I do see that our teams get it when we give them the why, because in a lot of cases they are also our consumers. And so it's what works for them too.
And I don't have any data point to back this up, but we talked about this, in our prep call. I have a question about whether or not meeting the residents where they are, and the prospects where they are, and giving them so many options. Like, would you like to tour here? Would you like to tour by yourself? Would you like to tour with a robot? All of those things. Like giving them all those options. Are we actually giving them more freedom, which is actually slowing the leasing velocity? So we come back to the where we started,
that's a good
which
question.
is that an impact, right? And if it is, they still are going to ultimately need housing, so it's more of a timing thing than it is anything else, which I think is what's proven out over a number of years.
Well, if the industry wants to hire me to do a focus group on that. Guys, thanks so much for spending the time getting here a little bit earlier to partake in this, and I really appreciate not just you guys being here, but the relationship and friendship that we've had over the years, and really appreciate all your time. And with that, this year's podcast is over.
Thanks, Wes.
Thanks, everyone.